The bullet was a 9 mm hollow point, standard issue, the kind that expands on impact, designed to stop a man in his tracks. Marcus Hale had carried rounds just like it through 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. He had loaded them into magazines in the dark by field while mortar shells shook the walls of forward operating bases in Helmand province. He had fired them at enemies he never saw, and enemies he saw too clearly. He knew what this bullet could do to a human body. He knew exactly how fast it could end a life. And now he sat on the bare floor of his apartment in Virginia Beach. Virginia, turning that single round between his thumb and forefinger, like a man rolling a coin while deciding whether to make a bet. The apartment was empty. Not temporarily empty, not between furniture deliveries empty. Empty the way a place gets when the person living in it has stopped believing they need things. No couch, no table, no photographs on the walls. Just a military rucksack in the corner. A sleeping bag spread on the floor where a bed should have been. And a Sig Sauer P226 lying 3 feet away with its magazine removed and set on the opposite side of the room. He had separated the weapon from its ammunition, the way you separate 2 dogs that might hurt each other if left alone. The bullet turned slowly between his fingers, not like a threat, like a question. That bullet did not kill Marcus Hale, but a dying dog in a frozen forest would save him. Not the way you think, not with warmth or comfort or any of the gentle things we imagine when we talk about rescue. This dog would save him by refusing to die. And in doing so, it would teach a man who had forgotten the point of living that sometimes the most broken among us are the ones who carry the rest of us home. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale stood at the edge of a forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a pack on his back and nothing ahead of him but trees. He had left the bullet on the windowsill of his apartment. He had not taken the gun. He had not thrown the bullet away either. It sat there on the sill, like an unanswered letter, waiting for him to come back and decide. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale had spent 12 years in the United States Navy SEALs. He had enlisted at 22, fresh out of a childhood that taught him more about survival than any military training ever would. His father left when Marcus was 9. His mother, Linda Hale, raised 2 boys on a nurse's salary in Norfolk, Virginia, working double shifts at Centara Norfolk General Hospital, while Marcus learned to cook dinner for his younger brother Jake and make sure the homework got done before the streetlights came on. He joined the Navy not for glory or patriotism, though he had plenty of both. He joined because it was the only door he could see that led somewhere other than where he already was. Bud/S nearly broke him. The infamous Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training Program, 6 months of controlled suffering designed to find the men who would not quit. Marcus did not quit. He did not quit when they held him underwater until his vision turned to static. He did not quit during Hell Week when he slept a total of 4 hours in 5 days and hallucinated conversations with his dead grandfather on the beach at Coronado. He did not quit because quitting was not something his body understood how to do even when his mind begged for it. He was assigned to SEAL Team 4 based at Naval Amphibious Base, Little Creek in Virginia Beach. Over the next 12 years, he deployed 5 times, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. He rose to Chief Petty Officer. He led men into places where the darkness was not a metaphor but a tactical reality, where you navigated by night vision and instinct, and the sound of your own breathing inside a helmet. He was good at his job, exceptional in fact. His fitness reports used words like decisive and composed under fire and natural leader. What they did not say, because no fitness report ever does, was that each deployment took something from him and left something else in its place. It took softness. It left vigilance. It took the ability to sit in a quiet room without scanning for exits. It left the inability to sleep without a weapon within arm's reach. 3 events broke him, though he would never have used that word. Marcus Hale did not believe in broken. He believed in operational and non-operational. He believed in mission capable and mission degraded. The language of the military does not accommodate the kind of breaking that happens inside a man's chest where no one can see it. The first was Rivera. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rivera, 29 years old, from Bayamon, Puerto Rico, SEAL Team 4. Marcus's closest friend in the unit, and the only person who had ever beaten him at poker, consistently enough to make it embarrassing. Rivera had a wife named Carmen and a daughter named Sofia who was 3 years old, and who called Marcus Uncle Mark in a voice so high-pitched it could cut through any noise on earth. Rivera was funny in the way that only men who have seen terrible things can be funny, finding humor in places where humor had no business existing, cracking jokes during pre-mission briefs, until even the commanding officer had to look away to hide a smile. On November 14, 2016, in Kunar province, Afghanistan, Marcus made a decision. His team needed to move through a narrow river valley to reach an extraction point. Intelligence reports had cleared the valley as safe. Marcus trusted the intelligence. He gave the order to advance. The intelligence was wrong. An RPG struck the lead vehicle from a concealed position on the ridgeline. The explosion flipped the armored truck and threw Rivera 30 feet. Marcus was in the second vehicle. He was out the door before the dust settled, running toward the wreckage while rounds cracked past his head, because that is what SEALs do. They run toward the thing that is trying to kill them. He found Rivera under the twisted frame of the vehicle, chest crushed, lungs filling with blood. Still alive but barely making a sound that Marcus would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Not a scream, not a moan, something quieter and more final. The sound a body makes when it is trying to live, but the mind has already accepted what is coming. Marcus pulled him out, applied pressure to wounds that had no business being survivable, called for medevac. The helicopter was 47 minutes away. Rivera died at minute 31. Marcus counted every one of those minutes. He held Rivera's hand and watched the light leave his eyes on a rocky valley floor, 7,000 miles from Bayamon. And when it was over, Marcus stood up, wiped his hands on his fatigues, and finished the mission. Because that is what you do. You finish the mission, and then you carry the dead with you forever. The second was his mother. Linda Hale was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2017. Marcus was in Helmand province when he got the Red Cross message. He requested emergency leave. It was denied due to operational necessity. His mother called him every Thursday from her hospital bed in Norfolk. He answered when he could, which was not often enough because missions do not schedule themselves around a dying woman's phone calls. She never complained. She never asked him to come home. She said, "I'm proud of you and take care of yourself and tell Jake I love him." And she never once said, "I'm scared though." Marcus knew she was, because he could hear it in the spaces between her words. Linda Hale died on a Tuesday morning in September of 2017. Marcus was asleep in a forward operating base in Helmand. He did not learn about it until 14 hours later. He did not attend the funeral. He could not attend the funeral. Jake stood alone at the graveside in Norfolk and held the folded flag that was meant for both of them. The third was Farid. Farid Ahmadi was an Afghan interpreter, 32 years old, who had worked with Marcus's team in Nangarhar province for 11 months. He had pulled Marcus out of a collapsed building during a nighttime raid gone wrong, digging through rubble with his bare hands while insurgents fired from across the street. Marcus owed Farid his life. More than that, he respected him in a way that transcended borders and uniforms. Farid was brave, loyal, and sharp, everything you want in a teammate, everything you want in a friend. When Marcus's final deployment ended, he filed the paperwork to get Farid a special immigrant visa. He promised Farid personally face to face that he would get him out before the withdrawal. He shook the man's hand and looked into his eyes and said the words, "I will not leave you behind." The paperwork sat on desks in Washington while bureaucrats debated processing times. In August of 2021, the Taliban took Kabul. Marcus watched the footage from his empty apartment in Virginia Beach, the chaos at Hamid Karzai International Airport. The desperate crowds, the C-17 lifting off with people clinging to the landing gear. He searched every evacuation list, every refugee manifest. Farid's name was not on any of them. Marcus Hale came home in June of 2021. Honorable discharge, full benefits, a handshake, and a folder of VA pamphlets he never opened. He moved into the apartment in Virginia Beach because it was close to the base and because proximity to the familiar felt safer than distance. But the apartment was not safe. It was quiet. And the quiet was louder than any combat he had ever experienced. He stopped sleeping. Not insomnia in the usual sense, not lying awake staring at the ceiling. He stopped sleeping because he was afraid of what waited in the dark behind his eyelids. Rivera bleeding out on the valley floor. His mother's phone ringing in an empty hospital room. Farid's face at the airport gate searching for a plane that had already left. He stopped eating regular meals, not because he lacked appetite, but because he forgot. His body still operated in combat mode. He scanned every room when he entered it. He sat with his back to the wall. He counted exits. He flinched at car backfires and fireworks and the sound of a helicopter passing overhead. But there was no combat. There was no mission. There was nothing to do with the coiled energy that his body had been trained to deploy at a moment's notice. So the energy turned inward, eating at him from the inside the way rust eats at iron. His brother Jake called every Sunday at 7. Jake was 28 and HV. AC technician in Roanoke, the kind of man who fixed things for a living and tried to fix his brother the same way with patience and steady hands, and the quiet hope that showing up consistently would eventually be enough. Marcus answered maybe one call in 3. When he did, the conversations followed a script. Jake would say, "How you doing?" Marcus would say, "Fine." Jake would say, "You eating?" Marcus would say, "Yeah." Jake would say, "You lying." And Marcus would hang up. But the last call before Marcus left for the mountains was different. There was something in Jake's voice that Marcus had not heard before. Not anger, not frustration, exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who loves someone who will not let him help. Jake said, "You don't have to be okay. You just have to not disappear." Marcus did not answer. He sat in the dark apartment with the phone pressed to his ear, and Jake's breathing on the other end, and the bullet on the windowsill catching the last light from the street below, and he said nothing. 2 days later, he packed his rucksack and drove west toward the Blue Ridge. He did not take the main trails. He bypassed the Appalachian Trail. The Blue Ridge Parkway overlooks the well-marked paths where families hiked on weekends. He found an unmarked trailhead south of Roanoke, a narrow gap in the underbrush that most people would walk past without noticing. He wanted to disappear, not in the sense of dying, though the distance between the two had become uncomfortably thin. In the literal sense, he did not want to be seen. He did not want to be found. He did not want to exist in anyone else's world. By the second day, he had left even the unmarked trail behind. He moved through raw wilderness, the kind of forest that had not seen a maintenance crew in years. Winter in the Appalachian Mountains is not beautiful the way it is in movies. There is no pristine white snow, no majestic frozen landscape. There are bare gray trees tangled together like the skeletons of giants. There is a floor of rotting leaves, slick and treacherous, hiding rocks and roots that can snap an ankle without warning. There is fog that sits so low and thick you cannot see 10 meters ahead. And there is cold. Not the dramatic wind howling cold of a Hollywood blizzard, a slow cold, a patient cold. The kind that seeps into your boots first, then your calves, then your hands, then your bones, until you realize you have been shivering for 20 minutes without noticing. Marcus moved through it all in silence. 12 years of operating in hostile terrain had turned him into a man who read the land the way others read a book, instinctively without conscious effort. He did not need a GPS. He did not need a map. He navigated by ridgeline and water flow and the angle of what little light filtered through the canopy. And he marked his path by snapping small branches at shoulder height, a habit drilled into him during SERE training at the Navy Survival School in the mountains of Southern California. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. He did it by reflex, not because he planned to come back. His body's survival instincts were still running, even though his conscious mind had stopped caring about the outcome. That was the most frightening thing about Marcus Hale in those first 2 days. Not that he wanted to die, that he had stopped caring whether he lived. The first night he camped in a hollow between two ridgelines sheltered from the wind, heated an MRE on a compact stove. No fire, old habits. He lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the black lattice of bare branches above him. And for the first time in months, the silence did not attack him. It simply existed, like a companion that expected nothing. He did not dream. His body was so depleted that even his subconscious could not summon the energy to produce nightmares. The second afternoon, the temperature dropped further, -5 Celsius. The forest grew denser. The terrain steepened. Marcus was descending a rocky slope when he heard the sound. It came through the wind like something from another world. Not a bark, not a whimper. Something between the two, a broken, desperate sound that was barely loud enough to register above the creak of frozen branches. The kind of sound you make when you have exhausted every other way to call for help, and all that remains is raw animal instinct. Marcus froze. His body went rigid in the way that only a combat veteran's body can, every sense sharpening simultaneously, the world narrowing to a single point of focus. He had heard a sound like this once before, in a shattered valley in Kunar province, coming from beneath a burning vehicle, from a man with 31 minutes left to live. He followed it, carefully, methodically, the way he had been trained to approach an unknown situation. Down the slope, through a thicket of rhododendron, across a frozen seep, until he found the source. The dog lay half buried beneath a tangle of fallen branches and frost-blackened leaves. A German shepherd mixed with Belgian Malinois, the kind of dog Marcus knew intimately because the United States military used them in canine units, the kind of dog trained to detect explosives and track insurgents, and put its body between its handler and danger without hesitation. This one was brown and gray, maybe 25 to 30 kilograms, though it was clearly far lighter than it should have been. Its ribs pressed against its skin like the hull of a ship stripped to its frame. Its right foreleg was bent at an angle that no natural joint could produce. Dried blood matted the fur on its neck and shoulders. Cuts and scrapes covered its body. It had been out here for days, 3 at least, maybe 4. Its eyes were clouded with pain, but they were open, and when Marcus crouched beside it, those eyes locked onto his with a focus that sent a cold current through his chest. Not fear, not desperation, recognition, as though this dog had been lying in the frozen dirt, broken and starving, waiting not for anyone but for him specifically. Marcus pulled off his gloves. His hands were steady, the hands of a man who had performed combat medicine under fire, who had sutured wounds in the back of helicopters, who had held together things that were falling apart for so long. It had become the only skill he trusted. He examined the dog carefully. The fracture was clean, no bone piercing the skin, but it would not heal without stabilization. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, multiple lacerations, and 2 things that did not belong. The first was the mark around its neck, a band of compressed fur where a collar had once sat, not a pet collar. A heavy-duty working collar, the kind used on dogs trained for search and rescue or military operations. Someone had owned this dog. Someone had trained it. The second was the fabric. Caught in the matted fur of its shoulder, tangled with mud and dried blood, were threads of cloth, red and black plaid flannel, the kind of shirt worn by hikers, hunters, people who live in the mountains. This fabric did not belong to Marcus. It came from someone else. Marcus touched the dog's head. It did not flinch, did not growl. It leaned into his palm with a pressure so gentle and so deliberate that it felt less like an animal seeking comfort and more like a handshake, an agreement, a pact between 2 creatures who had found each other at the edge of everything. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" Marcus said, and startled at the sound of his own voice. He had not spoken aloud in nearly a week. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he was forgetting how to use. He wrapped the dog in his jacket and lifted it into his arms. It was lighter than it should have been, like holding something already halfway gone. But there was warmth, still life, still fight. Marcus turned to head back toward the trail, back toward the road, back toward safety and veterinary care, and the world he had been trying to leave behind. And that is when the dog moved. It shifted in his arms, not from pain, but with intent. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, and looked deeper into the forest. Not randomly, not blindly, with purpose. The way a compass needle swings north, the way a soldier points toward the objective. And it made a sound, directed not at the sky but at something specific in the darkness between the trees. Marcus had worked with military dogs. He knew the difference between a panicked animal and one executing a trained behavior. This dog was not panicking. It was communicating. It was telling him that what mattered was not behind them on the road in the safe world. What mattered was ahead, deeper, in the cold heart of the forest where no trail led and no one would think to look. He stood there for a long moment, the injured dog in his arms, the temperature falling, the light fading, every rational instinct telling him to turn around. And then he noticed carved into the bark of an old oak tree at shoulder height, 2 letters and an arrow. TA, pointing west, into the deep woods. Someone had been here. Someone had marked a path. And that someone's initials were carved into the same direction this dying dog was now straining toward with every ounce of life it had left. "All right," Marcus whispered, adjusting his footing on the frozen ground. "Show me where you need to go." And he walked into the forest, toward the dark, toward the unknown, toward the thing that was waiting for both of them, though neither of them knew it yet. The dog settled in his arms, calmer now, as if the hardest part of its mission was already complete. It had found someone willing to follow. The deeper they went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their bare branches interlocking overhead like the fingers of clasped hands, blocking what little gray light remained in the winter sky. The ground became treacherous, a maze of hidden roots and moss-covered rocks slick with ice, each step a negotiation between balance and momentum. Marcus moved the way he had been trained, to move through hostile terrain weight, forward knees bent, scanning the ground 2 paces ahead, while keeping his peripheral vision wide. The dog lay still in his arms, its breathing shallow but steady, its head occasionally lifting to turn a few degrees left or right. Subtle corrections that Marcus followed without questioning. Minutes folded into each other. 30 became 60. 60 became 90. The cold deepened. Marcus could feel it now, not just on his skin but inside his chest, each breath entering his lungs like swallowing crushed glass. His arms ached from carrying the dog. His shoulders burned. The old shrapnel fragment in his right shoulder, the one the doctors at Bagram had said was too small and too deep to justify surgical removal, sent a dull throb down his arm with every step. But he did not stop. He had carried heavier loads over worse ground, in places where stopping meant dying. Somewhere in that long walk, Marcus began to talk. Not to the dog, not to anyone. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been silent so long that the words have backed up inside him like water behind a dam, and the pressure has finally become greater than the wall. He talked about Rivera, not about the ambush, about before. About the night Rivera taught him to play dominoes in the barracks at Little Creek, slamming the tiles down with a ferocity that made the table shake, laughing so loud that the duty officer came to tell them to keep it down. About Rivera's daughter Sofia, who had been born 6 weeks premature and spent her first month in a NICU in San Juan, and how Rivera had paced the floor of the team room like a caged animal until Carmen called to say the baby was breathing on her own. About the photograph Rivera kept taped inside his helmet, a picture of Sofia at 2 years old sitting in a red wagon wearing sunglasses too big for her face, grinning at the camera with 4 teeth. Rivera had shown that photograph to everyone. He had shown it to Afghan village elders during key leader engagements. He had shown it to a captured Taliban fighter during a tactical questioning session, not as an interrogation technique, but because Rivera genuinely could not understand how anyone could look at that photograph and not smile. He talked about his mother, not about her death, about her hands. Linda Hale had the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her life, strong fingers, short nails, calluses on her palms from decades of gripping hospital bed rails and IV poles, and the arms of patients too weak to stand on their own. When Marcus was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms, his mother would sit on the edge of his bed and press her palm flat against his chest right over his heart, and hold it there without saying a word until the fear passed. He could still feel the weight of that hand. He could still feel the warmth of it. And the thing that destroyed him, the thing he could never say to Jake or to the VA therapist or to anyone, was that he could not remember the last time he had felt a human hand on his chest. Not a handshake, not a pat on the back, a hand placed there with intention, with care, with the simple purpose of saying, "I am here and you are not alone." He talked about Farid, about the night Farid pulled him from the collapsed building in Nangarhar, digging through concrete and rebar with fingers that were bleeding before he even started shouting Marcus's name in the dark, while gunfire cracked overhead. About the morning after, when Farid sat across from him at a plywood table in the Tactical Operations Center, drinking chai from a chipped ceramic cup, and said in his careful accented English, "You Americans, you think you are the only ones who are brave, but bravery is not only for soldiers. Bravery is for anyone who wakes up in a dangerous place and decides to live another day." He said all of this to the trees, to the fog, to the freezing air and the silent dog in his arms. And the forest absorbed it the way forests absorb everything, without judgment, without answer, without the unbearable weight of another person's sympathy. It was the first time in years that Marcus had spoken these things aloud, and the only reason he could do it was because no one was listening. No one except a dying animal whose heartbeat he could feel against his forearm, faint and steady and stubborn. And then he saw it, not the whole structure, just a line, a single straight edge cutting through the organic chaos of the winter forest. In nature, there are no straight lines. Trees curve, rocks fracture at angles, streams wander. A straight line means human hands. It was the roofline of an A-frame cabin, nearly invisible beneath a blanket of dead leaves and broken branches. The walls were weathered gray, the color of wood that has been exposed to decades of mountain weather. The windows were dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints marked the thin snow around the foundation. But the door was open, not wide open, cracked, maybe 10 centimeters, just enough to notice. The dog woke fully. Its head came up from Marcus's chest with a sudden alert energy that had not been there before. Its ears rotated forward. Its eyes, which had been dull with pain for the past 2 hours, sharpened. And it made a sound that was stronger than anything it had produced since Marcus found it. Almost like an announcement, a declaration, "We are here." Marcus circled the cabin from 30 meters out, a full 360-degree observation sweep, the kind that 12 years of close-quarters combat had welded into his nervous system. No fresh tracks in the snow, no signs of recent activity around the exterior, no light through the windows. But the door was ajar, and in Marcus's experience, an open door in an empty place was never as empty as it looked. He approached from the west side, keeping his profile low, stepping over a fallen log and onto the warped wooden porch. The planks groaned under his weight. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, both hands occupied by the dog, and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, but not abandoned. There was a difference between a place that had been empty for months and a place that had been empty for days, and Marcus could feel that difference the way a tracker reads disturbed earth. On a small wooden table, a tin cup sat with a film of dried residue at the bottom. A chair held a folded wool blanket. In one corner, Supplies were stacked with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to living in remote places. Canned beans, canned tuna, pasta, bottled water, a cast iron skillet hanging from a nail on the wall, a half-finished bottle of bourbon on a shelf beside a box of kitchen matches. Someone lived here, someone organized, someone methodical, someone who was not here now. And then Marcus heard the breathing. It came from behind a closed door at the end of a narrow hallway so faint that most people would have missed it entirely. But Marcus had spent more than a decade operating in environments where the difference between a living room and a kill zone was the ability to detect sounds that did not belong. This sound belonged. It was a human being drawing air into lungs that did not want to cooperate. Shallow, irregular, spaced too far apart. The breathing of a body that was losing its argument with death. Marcus crossed the cabin in 4 strides. He shifted the dog to one arm, reached for the door handle with the other, paused for a single breath, and pushed it open. The man lay on the floor in the back room of the cabin, curled on his side like a child trying to stay warm, wrapped in a wool blanket that was soaked with something dark. He was somewhere between 55 and 60 years old. Silver hair, unkempt, matted against his forehead with dried sweat. A beard that had gone weeks without trimming. His face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over cheekbones that stood out like ridgelines on a topographic map. He wore a red and black plaid flannel shirt, the same pattern, the same fabric that Marcus had found caught in the dog's fur hours ago. And on his right side, beneath the hem of that shirt, a wound. Marcus knelt beside him and peeled back the makeshift bandage strips of torn cloth that had once been part of the same flannel shirt. The wound was a laceration approximately 15 centimeters long, running diagonally across the right side of the abdomen, deep enough to have reached the muscle layer. It had been self-treated, washed with what was probably water from the supply stores, and bandaged with what was available. But that had been days ago. The edges of the wound were swollen and discolored. The surrounding skin was hot to the touch, even though the man's overall body temperature was dangerously low. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the sour metallic scent of tissue beginning to lose its war against bacteria. Infection. Advanced. Possibly progressing to sepsis. Marcus checked the man's pulse. It was there, but barely, a faint, irregular flutter beneath skin that felt like cold paper. Respiratory rate roughly 8 breaths per minute, less than half of normal. Core temperature paradox, the body simultaneously hypothermic and febrile, cold extremities and a burning forehead. It was one of the most dangerous combinations in emergency medicine, and Marcus had seen it kill healthy young soldiers in Afghanistan. In a 58-year-old man who had been lying on a cabin floor for days without food, water, or medical care, it was a death sentence with a very short countdown. Marcus set the dog down. And the dog with the broken leg, the dog that had not eaten in days, the dog that should have been unable to move, crawled across the wooden floor to the man's side and placed its head on his chest. It settled there with the weight of absolute belonging, the way a key settles into the lock it was made for. Its tail moved once against the floor, a single beat, and then it lay still. Its eyes on Marcus filled with something that went beyond animal instinct. Something that looked unmistakably like relief. That was the moment Marcus understood. The dog had not been trying to save itself. It had been trying to save him. If you believe that loyalty like this, the kind that does not give up even when the body is broken, still exists in this world, take a moment right now to hit that like button. Stories like this deserve to be heard. Marcus flipped the switch. That was what combat medics called it. The moment when emotion shuts down and protocol takes over, when a SEAL's brain stops processing feelings and starts processing steps. He had not operated in this mode since Afghanistan. Now it engaged with the cold precision of a weapon being charged. First heat. The cabin had a cast iron wood stove in the main room, and Marcus spent 30 minutes coaxing it to life with damp kindling and strips of cardboard torn from supply boxes. The wood was too wet to catch easily, and he had to nurse each small flame like a living thing feeding its splinters, blowing gently at the base, shielding it from the drafts that knifed through gaps in the cabin walls. When the fire finally held, he boiled water in the only pot he could find, a dented aluminum saucepan crusted with old food. Then the wound. He cleaned his hands with iodine from his first aid kit, cut away the old bandage with his Swiss Army knife, and irrigated the laceration with diluted iodine solution. The man moaned, but did not wake. That was a bad sign. The body registering pain while the conscious mind remained offline meant the nervous system was functioning, but the brain was retreating, conserving energy for the only fight that mattered, the fight to keep the heart beating and the lungs moving. Marcus repacked the wound with clean gauze, the last of his supply. He reinforced it with strips of his own undershirt, creating a compression layer that would hold the gauze in place. He wrapped the man's torso in his outer jacket for additional insulation. Then he turned his attention to warming the body, pulling the man closer to the stove, layering blankets, elevating his feet on a folded sleeping bag to encourage blood flow to the core. He administered small sips of water through cracked lips, tilting the man's head back and letting gravity do the work the way he had given water to wounded Afghans in villages where there were no medical supplies and no medivac coming. While working, Marcus searched the cabin. In the man's pack, stuffed in a corner beneath a rain jacket and a pair of wool socks, he found two items. The first was a worn leather wallet containing a state identification card. Thomas Avery, age 58, address in Asheville, North Carolina. The photograph showed a man with kind eyes and a cautious smile at least 20 pounds heavier than the skeleton lying on the floor. The second item was a letter, folded multiple times, the paper soft and creased from handling. It was addressed in handwriting that had once been steady but had grown shaky toward the end, to someone named Sarah. Marcus did not read it, not yet. He placed it back in the pack and returned to the work of keeping Thomas Avery alive. Through all of this, the dog lay beside the man, its head on his chest, watching Marcus with absolute attention, not with suspicion, not with aggression, with the focus of a nurse monitoring a surgeon. Every time Marcus's hands moved near the wound, the dog's eyes followed. Every time Marcus paused to check vitals, the dog's ears twitched forward. It never relaxed. It never looked away. It was standing guard over the man it had crossed a frozen mountain to save. The storm arrived that night. It came with almost no warning, the way nor'easters sometimes descend on the southern Appalachians, a sudden wall of wind and snow that transforms a quiet forest into something primal. Wind gusts of 60 to 70 kilometers per hour slammed against the cabin walls. Snow fell so thick and fast that the windows turned white within minutes. The temperature, already dangerously low, plummeted to minus 15 Celsius. The cabin, which had felt like shelter an hour ago, suddenly felt like a raft in an ocean. Everything shook. The roof groaned. The walls creaked. Wind found every gap, every crack, every imperfect joint in the old wood and poured through like water through a sieve. The fire in the stove guttered and nearly died twice. Marcus sealed gaps with blankets, clothing, anything he could find. He dismantled a wooden chair and fed it to the stove piece by piece. He moved Thomas closer to the heat source and positioned his own body as a windbreak between the drafts and the dying man. 3 lives in a box of old wood in the middle of a mountain blizzard. A man who was dying, a dog that could not walk, and a soldier who, for the first time in months, had no time to think about whether his own life was worth living, because he was too busy trying to save someone else's. It happened at 2 in the morning. Marcus was sitting against the wall, his back aching, his eyes half closed, drifting in the space between consciousness and collapse, when the dog barked. Not the weak sound from before. A full, sharp, explosive bark that cracked through the cabin like a rifle shot. Marcus was on his feet before his brain fully engaged, his body responding to the alarm before his mind could process it. He looked at Thomas. Thomas Avery was not breathing, not struggling to breathe, not breathing shallowly, not breathing at all. His chest was still. His lips were blue. Marcus dropped to his knees and pressed 2 fingers against the man's carotid artery. Nothing. No pulse. No movement. No life. Marcus placed the heel of his left hand on the center of Thomas's chest, laced his right hand over it, locked his elbows, and began compressions. 30 compressions at a depth of 2 inches delivered at a rate of 100 per minute. 2 rescue breaths, repeat. He had learned this at Bud's refined it in combat medicine courses at Fort Bragg and performed it in the field 3 times on men who were younger and stronger than Thomas Avery. 2 of those men had lived, 1 had not. The mathematics of CPR are brutal. Even under ideal conditions with defibrillators and IV access and a full trauma team standing by, survival rates hover around 25%. In a cabin in a blizzard with no equipment and no backup, the odds were significantly worse. Marcus did not think about the odds. He compressed, he breathed, he compressed again. He felt Thomas's ribs flex and then crack beneath his hands. The sternum separating from the costal cartilage with a sound like stepping on a dry branch. It happened in almost every prolonged CPR effort, but knowing that did not make the sensation any less sickening. 1 minute. The dog barked again, a single fierce sound, as if issuing an order. 2 minutes. Marcus's arms burned. Sweat ran down his temples despite the freezing air. He adjusted his position, drove his weight downward, forced blood through a heart that had decided to quit. 3 minutes. Nothing. No response, no cough, no twitch. Marcus began to calculate the point at which effort becomes futility. The line every medic knows exists but never wants to reach. And then Thomas coughed. It was small, wet, more of a convulsion than a voluntary act. But it was followed by a breath. A real breath, air entering lungs and expanding the chest wall. Then another breath. Then a pulse, irregular and weak, but undeniably present, a fragile rhythm tapping against Marcus's fingertips like a message in code. I am here. I am still here. Marcus sat back on his heels. His arms trembled. His hands would not stop shaking. And he realized with a clarity that felt like being struck by cold water that this was the first time since coming home from Afghanistan that he had kept someone alive. He had carried the dead for years. Rivera, his mother, the ghost of Farid. He had carried them the way Atlas carries the sky, not because he chose to, but because he did not know how to set them down. But tonight on this frozen floor, with a blizzard screaming outside and a dog barking beside him, he had reached into the space between life and death and pulled a man back to this side of the line. The dog stopped barking. It looked at Marcus with an expression that in a human face would have been called gratitude. Then it laid its head back on Thomas's chest, positioning itself directly over the heartbeat it had fought to preserve. Its tail tapped once, then twice, a slow, steady rhythm. Thomas Avery opened his eyes the following afternoon. The storm had eased but not ended, leaving the world outside the cabin windows a featureless white. Snow had drifted against the walls to a depth of nearly half a meter. There would be no leaving today. Thomas's eyes were gray and unfocused, taking a long time to settle. He looked at Marcus without recognition, the blank gaze of a man surfacing from a depth he had not expected to return from. Then he looked down. The dog was still on his chest, and his lips moved. He whispered a single word. Ranger. The name hung in the cold air between them. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of it. Its tail moved, and Thomas Avery closed his eyes again, not from unconsciousness this time, but from something else. Something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a man who has just discovered that the world did not let him go. Over the next 2 days, trapped together by snow and necessity, Thomas told his story in fragments, in sentences that cost him visible effort, in words spaced between long silences and sips of warm water that Marcus held to his lips. Thomas Avery had spent 28 years with the United States Forest Service, stationed at Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina. He had known these mountains the way a sailor knows the sea, by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated wisdom of decades spent inside them. He could identify a tree species by the sound of the wind through its canopy. He could read the weather by the behavior of the birds. He could navigate to any point within 100 square miles without a compass. Because the landscape itself was his compass, every ridge and creek and rock formation a landmark as familiar as the furniture in his own home. He had carved trail markers into trees along the routes he walked most often. His initials and an arrow. TA, the same marks Marcus had noticed on the oak tree hours before. It was how Thomas kept track of his world. The way a man who has spent his life in the forest writes his name into it. He had retired in 2019, not by choice. His wife Sarah had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and Thomas had decided that the mountains could wait, but Sarah could not. She died in March of 2021 in the bedroom of their house in Asheville, holding his hand. They had no children. After 31 years of marriage, Thomas discovered that knowing the forest intimately did not prepare you for the specific emptiness of a house where someone's voice used to be. He had started returning to the mountains because they were the only place that did not remind him of what was missing. The cabin had been their place, his and Sarah's. Every autumn for 2 decades they had spent a week there together, hiking during the day, reading by the fire at night, existing in the kind of comfortable silence that only people who have loved each other for a very long time can share. He found Ranger 6 months ago, a stray lingering at the edge of the forest, half wild, wary of humans, but unable to fully abandon the proximity to them. Thomas had earned the dog's trust the way you earn anything worth having, slowly, with patience, without demands. Weeks of leaving food at a distance, weeks of sitting nearby without reaching. Until one morning, Ranger simply followed him to the cabin and did not leave. Thomas named him Ranger because every morning, without fail, the dog circled the cabin perimeter as if conducting an inspection, as if it had been assigned a post and intended to hold it. 2 weeks before Marcus found them, Thomas had been splitting firewood when the axe glanced off a knot in the oak and caught him across the right side. The cut was deep, but initially manageable, the kind of injury that a younger man with access to a first aid kit and a car could have handled with stitches and antibiotics and a stern lecture from a doctor. But Thomas was 58 years old, alone, nearly 7 miles from the nearest road, with no cell phone service and no one expecting him. Infection set in by the 3rd day, fever by the 4th. By the 5th day, Thomas could no longer stand, and Ranger had gone. Thomas remembered it dimly through the fog of fever and pain. The dog standing at the cabin door, looking back at him with an expression that Thomas, in his delirium, had interpreted as apology. Then it was gone into the forest, running toward nothing it could name, driven by an instinct older and more powerful than any training. Its person was dying. It had to find help. Somewhere on that desperate journey, Ranger had fallen, broken its leg, been cut and battered by the mountains in different terrain. But it had not stopped. It had kept moving until its body physically could not carry it one more step. And then it had lain down in the forest, in the cold, in the dirt, and waited, not to die, to be found. Thomas told Marcus one more thing. He told it quietly, almost reluctantly, the way a man shares something he is not sure he believes but cannot bring himself to deny. During the days he lay alone in the cabin, drifting in and out of consciousness, he had dreamed of Sarah. Not the Sarah who was sick, the Sarah who was young. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin, wearing the blue flannel shirt she always wore on their autumn trips. Her hair loose, her expression calm, and she had said to him in a voice as clear as spring water, "Don't be scared. I sent someone." Thomas was a man of science, a man who had spent nearly 3 decades measuring rainfall and tracking wildlife populations and filing reports based on observable data. He did not believe in visions. He did not believe in messages from the dead. But he told Marcus this with wet eyes and a voice that shook. And Marcus, who also did not believe in anything he could not see or verify, found that he had no words to argue. Before we go on, if you have ever known someone who came home from war and struggled to find their way back, If you have ever felt the kind of emptiness that Thomas and Marcus both carried, take a moment to share this story. Someone out there needs to hear it. On the second night in the cabin, the two men talked, not about the wound or the storm or the logistics of survival, about the things that had brought them both to this mountain, the real things. Thomas talked about Sarah, about how she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, a laugh so loud and so genuine that strangers in restaurants would turn to look, about the lavender she planted around their house in Asheville, even though the mountain soil was too acidic and the altitude too high. And every gardening book said it would not grow. And how it grew anyway, because Sarah approached the natural world the same way she approached everything else, with stubborn optimism and a refusal to accept limitations. About her hands in the hospital, thin and cold, holding his. About the last thing she said to him: "Don't sit here watching me die. Go outside, breathe." And how he had not gone. And how she had died with his hand in hers. And how he would not trade those final minutes for anything in the world. And how they haunted him every single day. Marcus listened. And then for the first time he spoke. Not the facts of what happened. Thomas did not need a briefing. Marcus simply said what he had never been able to say. "I was the team leader. I gave the order. The intelligence was wrong, but the order was mine." His name was Rivera. He was 29. He had a daughter named Sophia. He died at minute 31 out of 47. I killed him. Thomas was silent for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the walls. Ranger breathed steadily on Thomas's chest. Then Thomas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a man who had spent 28 years making decisions in a wilderness where mistakes had consequences. "You made a decision based on the information you had. That is what soldiers do. That is what rangers do. That is what anyone who has ever been responsible for another person's life has to do. And sometimes the information is wrong. That is not a failure of character. That is the cost of being the one who has to decide." Marcus did not respond, but something moved inside him. Something that had been locked in a room for 5 years, sealed behind a door he had welded shut, because opening it felt more dangerous than any combat he had ever faced. Thomas's words did not open that door, but they touched the handle. And for the first time, Marcus did not flinch away from the possibility that someday the door might open and what came out might not destroy him. That night, the wind knocked Thomas's pack from the shelf where Marcus had placed it. A folded piece of paper slid across the floor and came to rest against Marcus's boot. He picked it up, recognized it. The letter to Sarah. He intended to fold it back without reading. But the first line was already in front of his eyes, written in handwriting that trembled at the edges. "Sarah, I came up here to be near you one last time." He read the rest. It was not long. Thomas had written to his dead wife that he was not planning to return from the mountain. Not suicide. He used no violent words, described no deliberate act. It was something quieter than that. Something more like surrender. He was going to stay in the cabin, their cabin, and let the forest do what forests do. Take things back. Return them to the soil. He was tired of carrying the weight of a life that no longer had her in it, and he wanted to set it down in the only place that still felt like home. Marcus placed the letter on the floor. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, because he understood. He understood with a precision that cut through every defense he had ever built. The bullet on the windowsill in Virginia Beach was not a decision. It was a question. And Thomas's letter was the same question written in different handwriting. Marcus had come to this mountain for the same reason Thomas had come to this cabin. Not to die, but to stop the exhausting work of living. And now Marcus sat in a freezing cabin looking at a man whose lungs were filled with air that Marcus had physically forced back into them. And he felt something shift. Not a dramatic revelation, not an epiphany. Something smaller and more honest than that. A recognition. If he had fought that hard, that desperately, that furiously to keep Thomas Avery alive, then somewhere beneath the grief and the guilt and the crushing weight of everything he had lost, Marcus Hale still believed that a human life was worth fighting for, even his own. He folded the letter, put it back in Thomas's pack, sat down beside Ranger, placed his hand on the dog's warm head, closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep without being afraid of what was waiting on the other side. He woke before dawn on the third day. The storm had passed. He stepped outside and the world was white and silent and transformed. Snow lay nearly half a meter deep in every direction, covering the forest floor, bending branches to the ground, erasing every trail and landmark and navigational reference he had noted on his way in. The forest had become a blank page, and somewhere on that page, 5 to 7 kilometers to the east, was a road, a phone, a rescue team, a hospital. Thomas needed that hospital, not in a few days, not tomorrow, in hours. The infection was advancing. The fever was climbing. The reprieve that CPR had bought was temporary alone against a debt that biology would collect with interest. Marcus stood in the snow and looked at the white wilderness and did the calculation. He could stay, wait for the weather to clear fully, wait for someone to notice Thomas's absence, wait for a search party that might not come for days. Or he could go. Leave Ranger and Thomas in the cabin, walk alone through knee-deep snow with no trail and no certainty, and try to reach the road before Thomas's body cashed the check that infection had written. He looked down at Ranger standing in the cabin doorway on 3 good legs and one that would never be quite right. The dog looked back at him, and Marcus remembered what Ranger had done. This dog had gone into the forest alone on a broken leg, with no destination because its person was dying, and doing nothing was not an option. The dog had not chosen safety. It had chosen action. It had chosen the harder path because the harder path was the only one that led anywhere worth going. Before leaving, he stacked firewood beside the stove and left the damper adjusted so the fire would burn slowly for hours. He placed water within arm's reach of Thomas, along with 2 cans of beans and the last 3 ibuprofen tablets. He rebandaged the wound with a section of cotton undershirt he had boiled the night before and dried by the stove. He stabilized Ranger's broken leg with fresh splinting, using 2 straight sticks and strips of duct tape from a toolbox under the cabin's workbench. He gave the dog water, fed it small pieces of canned tuna, and placed it beside Thomas on the blanket. Thomas was conscious barely. His eyes tracked Marcus with the sluggish awareness of a man operating on the last fumes of his reserves. He seemed to understand what Marcus was doing, that leaving was necessary, that staying would be the easier and more fatal choice for all 3 of them. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked back at them. The old man on the floor breathing in shallow, careful sips of air. The dog beside him broken, but present, its head on his chest, its eyes on Marcus. 2 damaged creatures keeping each other alive by proximity alone. "Keep him warm for me," Marcus said to the dog. Then he checked his compass, tightened his bootlaces, and walked into the white. Marcus left the cabin at 7 in the morning. The sky was the color of old steel, low and heavy, the kind of sky that promises nothing and takes everything. The snow was knee-deep and crusted on top with a thin layer of ice that broke with each step, forcing him to lift his legs high and drive them forward like a man wading through wet concrete. Every step cost twice the energy it should have. Every 100 meters felt like a mile. The first hour was mechanical. Marcus navigated the way he had been trained during SARE school, reading the land the way water reads it. Water flows downhill. Follow a creek long enough and it leads to a larger stream. Follow the stream and it becomes a river. Follow the river and it reaches a valley. Valleys have roads. Roads have people. People have phones. The logic was simple. The execution was not. He found traces of his original route, the snapped branches he had left at shoulder height 2 days before. Most were buried under snow, invisible, useless. But every 4th or 5th marker had survived the ones on thicker branches that could bear the weight of ice without sagging. He followed them like a man reading a half-erased map, filling in the gaps with dead reckoning and compass bearings, and the instinct of someone who had spent a decade moving through terrain that was actively trying to kill him. The forest after the nor'easter was unrecognizable. Fallen trees blocked paths that had been cleared 2 days before, their root systems torn from the frozen earth and standing upright like the upended hulls of shipwrecks. Smaller trees had bent under the snow's weight and formed arches across the landscape, creating a low canopy that forced Marcus to crouch and duck and sometimes crawl. The creek he had crossed on the way in had swollen with snowmelt and refrozen into a sheet of opaque ice that extended several meters beyond its original banks, hiding the actual water's edge and making every step near it a gamble. He fell 3 times in the first 2 hours. The first was a simple slip on an icy route caught by his hands, no damage. The second was a stumble over a buried rock that sent him to one knee and drove a sharp pain through his left kneecap. The third was the one that mattered. His right foot broke through a layer of crusted snow covering a gap between 2 boulders, and his momentum carried him forward and down. His right shoulder, the one carrying the old shrapnel fragment from a firefight in Helmand Province in 2014, slammed directly into the exposed edge of a granite outcropping. The pain was immediate and extraordinary. A white flash that started at the point of impact and radiated down his arm and across his chest like a current seeking ground. For a full 10 seconds, his right arm was useless. He lay on the frozen rock with his face in the snow and breathed through his teeth until the initial shock subsided and the pain dialed back from blinding to merely severe. He got up, tested the arm. Range of motion was compromised but functional, nothing broken. The shrapnel fragment, a piece of steel roughly the size of a pencil eraser, that had been lodged in the soft tissue of his posterior deltoid for 7 years, had been driven deeper into the muscle by the impact. He could feel it now in a way he had not before. A hard foreign pressure against the surrounding tissue, a constant reminder that the things we carry from war do not always stay where we put them. He kept walking. By the 3rd hour, the terrain began to descend. Down meant closer to the valley floor. Closer to the valley floor meant closer to the Blue Ridge Parkway. He adjusted his pace, trading caution for speed, accepting the increased risk of falls in exchange for time. Thomas did not have the luxury of caution. Thomas was on a clock, and every minute Marcus spent being careful was a minute Thomas might not have. The creek appeared at the 4-hour mark. Under normal conditions, it was a modest mountain stream, maybe 3 meters wide, shallow enough to wade through without getting your knees wet. Marcus had crossed it easily on the way in, hopping from stone to stone without breaking stride. But the nor'easter had rewritten the landscape's hydrology. Snowmelt had fed the creek into something wider and angrier, a 5 to 6 meter channel of water so cold it seemed to reject the concept of motion, flowing not with the cheerful energy of a mountain stream, but with the slow, heavy inevitability of something that knew exactly where it was going and did not care what stood in its path. The water was opaque gray-brown with sediment, offering no clue about the depth or the nature of the bottom. On either side, the terrain rose sharply into rock faces too steep and too icy to climb. There was no way around it. Marcus had to go through. He secured his pack, tightening the straps until it was locked against his back like a second rib cage. He zipped every pocket, sealed every opening, knowing that once the pack absorbed water, it would double in weight, and he would be carrying an anchor. He took one breath, then another. Then he stepped in. The cold did not feel like cold. It felt like electricity. Every nerve in his lower body fired simultaneously, a full system alarm that his brain interpreted not as temperature, but as damage, as if the water were not freezing but burning. His muscles seized, his lungs locked, his diaphragm spasmed, and for 3 full seconds he could not inhale. This was the mammalian cold shock response, an involuntary physiological reaction to sudden immersion in near-freezing water. He had been trained to expect it. But training and experience are different animals, and the experience of standing waist-deep in water that was 1 or 2 degrees above freezing was something that no amount of preparation could fully soften. He forced himself forward. One step. Two. The bottom was uneven, a jagged mosaic of submerged rocks coated with algae that offered almost no friction. The current was not strong, maybe 2 knots, but it was persistent, pushing against his legs with the patient insistence of something that had all the time in the world. The water climbed from his waist to his chest as he hit a deeper channel in the center. His back began to absorb water despite his precautions. He felt it growing heavier on his back, pulling him backward, tilting his center of gravity toward the downstream side. At the midpoint of the crossing, his left foot found a rock that was not there. Or rather, it found the curved algae slick surface of a rock that offered no purchase whatsoever. And his weight, already compromised by the waterlogged pack, shifted past the point of recovery. He went down. The water closed over his chest. His hands shot out instinctively, grasping for anything solid, finding nothing but current and cold. The stream carried him 2 meters downstream before his left hand caught the edge of a submerged boulder and held. His body pivoted around that single point of contact, legs swinging in the current like a flag in the wind. Water splashed over his face, into his mouth, carrying the taste of iron and stone and winter. The cold was no longer an external sensation. It was inside him now, moving through his blood, his muscles, his bones, colonizing his body, one system at a time. And in that moment, lying in the stream with his body shutting down and his grip on the rock beginning to fail, Marcus Hale thought about the bullet on the windowsill. He thought about how simple it would be, how clean. Not even a decision, really, just a release. Let go of the rock. Let the current take him downstream around the next bend into the deeper water, where the cold would do its work quickly and without malice. No pain, no struggle, no more carrying the dead, no more waking at 3 in the morning to the sound of Rivera's breathing getting slower. No more hearing his mother's phone ring in an empty room. No more seeing Farid's face in the crowd at the airport searching for a plane that had already gone. Just silence. The same silence he had been looking for when he drove to these mountains 3 weeks ago. His fingers loosened on the rock. Not deliberately, not consciously. But the cold was taking his grip the way it takes everything, slowly, patiently, without drama. And somewhere in the back of his brain, the part that was still running. Calculations, even as the rest of him considered surrender. A small voice pointed out that this would be easy, that no one would know, that Jake would wait for his Sunday call, and it would never come, and eventually they would find him downstream, and it would look like an accident, and no one would ever have to carry the knowledge that Marcus Hale had chosen this. Then he thought about Ranger, a dog with a broken leg, starving, dehydrated, in pain, crawling through a frozen forest because somewhere behind it a man was dying, and the dog had decided that doing nothing was worse than doing something, even if the something was impossible. That dog had not calculated the odds. It had not weighed the costs. It had not asked whether the mission was survivable. It had simply gone. Because its person needed help, and it was the only one who could try. He thought about Thomas, lying on the cabin floor, breathing with lungs that Marcus had restarted with his own hands. Alive because Marcus had refused to stop compressing, refused to accept the silence, refused to let the count reach the number where effort becomes futility. He thought about Jake, standing in the parking lot of a motel somewhere in the future that might not happen if Marcus let go of this rock. Jake, who called every Sunday. Jake, who always picked up on the first ring. Jake, who had said the only thing that mattered in a voice cracked with the exhaustion of loving someone who would not let him help. You don't have to be okay. You just have to not disappear. Marcus tightened his grip on the rock. His fingers screamed. The cold had taken most of the feeling in his hands, reducing them to crude tools that operated on mechanical force rather than sensation. But they held. He pulled, inch by inch. His right arm, the one with the shrapnel and the fresh bruise and 7 years of accumulated damage, shook violently, the muscles firing in uncoordinated bursts. His left hand found a second grip point, a crack in the rock just wide enough for 2 fingers. He jammed them in and pulled again. His chest scraped over the boulder's edge. His knees found purchase on the creek bed. And then he was up on the far bank, lying face down in the snow, shaking so hard that his teeth cracked against each other in staccato bursts. He lay there for 30 seconds. Then he rolled over. Then he stood. He stripped off his wet outer layer. It was counterintuitive removing clothing in freezing conditions, but it was correct. Wet fabric against skin is a heat pump in reverse, pulling warmth from the body and feeding it to the atmosphere. He dug into his pack and found the one dry thermal layer that remained a synthetic base layer he had sealed in a waterproof bag at the bottom of the rucksack. He pulled it on over his bare, trembling torso and zipped it to his chin. It was not warm, but it was dry. And dry was the difference between hypothermia that kills and hypothermia that merely degrades. He checked his compass. East, still east, always east. He walked. The last 2 hours were the worst. Not because of the terrain, though the terrain continued to punish him with every step. Not because of the cold, though the cold had settled into his joints and his muscles and the marrow of his bones, like a tenant that intended to stay. The worst part was the hallucinations. They began subtly, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision that resolved into nothing when he turned to look. A shadow between the trees that held the shape of a man for just a moment too long. Then they became more specific, more personal. Rivera stood beside a hemlock tree wearing his combat fatigues. His body intact, no wounds, no blood, his face carrying the expression he always wore before a mission, calm and slightly amused, as if war were a game he had figured out and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Marcus blinked, and Rivera was gone. A woman sat on a boulder beside the trail. He had never met her, but he knew who she was. Blue flannel shirt, hair loose around her shoulders, kind eyes. She looked at him the way you look at someone you have been expecting, not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of confirmation. Marcus blinked again, and the boulder was empty. Ranger ran ahead of him through the snow, healthy, strong, no limp, bounding through the drifts with the boundless energy of a dog that has never known injury or hunger or the desperate mathematics of loyalty. Marcus watched it disappear around a bend and felt a stab of something in his chest that was not pain and not grief, but something adjacent to both, a longing for a version of reality where nothing was broken and no one had to be carried. He knew what was happening. Mild hypothermia combined with exhaustion and caloric depletion. The brain, running low on fuel and operating at reduced temperature, begins to generate sensory data from stored memory. Not dangerous in themselves, but dangerous because they could lead to disorientation, to wandering off course, to stopping. And stopping in these conditions meant dying. Marcus slapped himself, open palm across his own right cheek. The pain was sharp and clarifying, a reset button for a system that was beginning to drift. He checked his compass, adjusted his course 5 degrees to compensate for a ridge pushing him northeast, kept walking. One more step, one more step, one more step. And then he heard it. Not a hallucination, not a ghost. The sound of an internal combustion engine filtered through trees and distance and cold air, but unmistakable. The rumble of a vehicle on pavement. Real pavement. A real road. Marcus moved faster. His legs, which had been operating on a diminishing reserve of willpower for the past hour, found something new. Not energy. Energy was gone. Something more primitive than energy. The same force that drives a wounded animal toward water, toward shelter, toward the thing it needs in order to survive. He stumbled, fell, got up, fell again, crawled for several meters through a thicket of rhododendron, the waxy leaves slapping against his face and arms, the branches grabbing at his pack like hands trying to hold him back. He broke through the tree line and stopped. The Blue Ridge Parkway stretched before him, a ribbon of black asphalt beneath a thin veil of snow curving gently along the contour of the mountain. It was the most beautiful thing Marcus Hale had ever seen. Not because of the view, because of what it represented. Connection, communication. The possibility of help arriving in time. A pickup truck was parked on the shoulder, 50 meters to his right, its engine idling, exhaust rising in a white plume. A man stood beside it, an older man with white hair and weathered skin, wearing insulated overalls and leather work gloves, pulling a fallen branch off the roadway and tossing it into the ditch. He looked up as Marcus emerged from the forest, and his face went through a sequence of expressions: curiosity, confusion, alarm. "Good Lord, son," the man said. "Where did you come from?" Marcus looked at him. He was aware of how he must appear. Soaking wet below the chest, shivering uncontrollably, lips blue, skin the color of ash, eyes carrying the particular wildness of a man who has recently negotiated with death and is not entirely sure about the outcome. He said 3 sentences, only 3. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by cold air and disuse, and the effort of breathing through a body that was trying very hard to shut down. "There is a man in the forest. He is dying. Call 911. The man's name was Earl. He did not ask questions. He did not hesitate. He pulled a cell phone from his overalls, dialed 911, and handed it to Marcus. Marcus gave the dispatcher coordinates, compass bearings, landmarks, a clinical description of Thomas's condition, and probable diagnosis. The dispatcher transferred him to Buncombe County Search and Rescue. A 6-person team was mobilized within 40 minutes. Marcus wanted to lead them in himself. The paramedics who arrived with the rescue team told him he was in no condition to walk anywhere except into the back of the ambulance. They compromised. Marcus sat in the rescue vehicle, wrapped in thermal blankets, sipping warm fluid, and guided the team via radio, describing the route, the markers, the cabin's position relative to the creek and the ridgeline. 4 hours later, the team radioed back. They had found the cabin. Thomas Avery was alive, conscious, responsive. The fire was still burning. The water was still within reach. And Ranger was still lying on his chest, keeping him warm, keeping him present, refusing to leave. Thomas was airlifted to Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. The medical team diagnosed severe wound infection with early-stage sepsis, moderate hypothermia, critical dehydration, and acute malnutrition. The attending physician, a trauma surgeon who had served 2 tours with the Army Medical Corps in Iraq, told Marcus privately that without the CPR, the wound care and the fire that Marcus had maintained, Thomas Avery would have died within 12 hours of Marcus's arrival. The CPR alone, performed on a cold cabin floor in a blizzard with no equipment, had bought Thomas the time his body needed to keep fighting until professional help arrived. Ranger was transported to a veterinary clinic in Asheville. The broken foreleg was set and cast. Lacerations were cleaned and sutured. IV fluids were administered for dehydration. The veterinarian, a woman in her 60s who had treated working dogs for 3 decades, told Marcus that Ranger was the most remarkable animal she had encountered in her career. The injuries alone should have immobilized the dog within hours. Instead, it had traveled an estimated 3 to 4 miles through mountain terrain on a broken leg, driven by nothing except the understanding that someone it loved was in danger, and lying still was not an option. Marcus was treated for mild hypothermia, contusions, and exhaustion. He refused inpatient care. He checked into a motel in Asheville, 4 miles from the hospital, and for the next 3 weeks, he lived a life that consisted of 2 destinations. Every morning he drove to Mission Hospital and sat with Thomas. Every afternoon, he drove to the veterinary clinic and sat with Ranger. He ate meals from a diner across the street. He slept in a bed for the first time in weeks. And slowly, in the way that a river erodes stone, not in a single dramatic event, but through the persistent, patient application of force over time, something inside him began to change. Thomas Avery recovered. The infection responded to intravenous antibiotics. The wound closed. Strength returned grudgingly, the way strength returns to a body that has been forced to negotiate with death and is still processing the terms of the settlement. When Thomas was well enough to sit up and talk, he and Marcus had a conversation that neither had planned and both needed. Thomas said, "You read the letter." Marcus nodded. Thomas looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said, "I was not planning to die. I just was not planning to live. There is a difference." Marcus said, "I know. I was the same." It was the first time he had said it aloud. The first time he had acknowledged in words spoken to another human being that he had been standing at an edge. Not in the forest. Before. In Virginia Beach. With the bullet on the windowsill and the gun across the room and the empty apartment that echoed with the absence of every person he had failed to save. Thomas studied him. Then he said something that Marcus would carry for the rest of his life. He said it simply without drama in the plain language of a man who had spent his career talking to trees and mountains and animals and had never learned the art of making things sound more complicated than they were. That dog did not know who you were, did not know you were a seal, did not know you were hurting, did not know you were good at saving people. It just knew you were the only human being it found, and it decided you were enough. Maybe you should start believing that too. Marcus called Jake from the parking lot of the motel that evening. Not because it was Sunday, not because he felt obligated, because he wanted to hear his brother's voice. Because for the first time in longer than he could remember, making a phone call felt like reaching out rather than giving in. Jake answered on the first ring. He always answered on the first ring. Marcus said, "Hey." Jake said, "Hey, you okay?" Marcus paused. And then he said something he had never said before. Not to Jake, not to anyone. Not really. But I am here. Jake drove 3 hours from Roanoke to Asheville. He walked into the motel room and looked at his brother, thinner, exhausted, carrying new bruises and old scars and 7 years of embedded shrapnel, and the weight of everyone he could not save, and beneath all of it something different. Something that had not been there before. Not healing, not peace. Something smaller and more honest than either. A willingness, a crack in the door. Jake said, "You did not disappear." Marcus said, "No, I did not disappear." They stood in the motel room and looked at each other, and Jake nodded once and Marcus nodded back, and nothing else needed to be said. Because some things between brothers are communicated in frequencies that language cannot reach. 3 weeks later, Ranger was discharged from the veterinary clinic. The leg had healed well enough for weight-bearing, though the veterinarian warned that the dog would always walk with a slight unevenness, a permanent reminder of the journey it had made through the frozen forest. It would not be painful, but it would be visible, a limp that told a story. The question of where Ranger belonged was settled quickly. Thomas said, "He is yours." Marcus protested. "You found him first. You fed him. You gave him a home." Thomas shook his head. "I found him. But he found you. There is a difference." On the day of Ranger's discharge, Marcus drove to the clinic alone. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room and looked inside. Ranger was lying in its kennel head, resting on its front paws, eyes fixed on the door. When it saw Marcus, it did not bark. It did not jump or spin or perform any of the theatrical displays of canine excitement that movies teach us to expect. It stood up, slowly, steadily, 3 good legs and one that would always carry a story. It walked to the kennel gate and sat, and it looked at Marcus with the same eyes that had looked at him on the forest floor 3 weeks ago. The same patience, the same certainty, the same quiet, unshakable conviction that this particular human being was exactly where he was supposed to be. Marcus knelt. Ranger stepped forward and placed its head against his chest. Not against his hand or his leg or his shoulder, against his chest, directly over his heart. The same place his mother used to put her palm when he was 7 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. And Marcus Hale, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEALs. A man who had not cried since the day he held Miguel Rivera's hand in a valley in Cunar province felt something break open inside him. Not the kind of breaking that destroys, the kind that releases, the kind that lets the thing trapped inside finally move, finally breathe, finally exist outside the locked room where it had been stored for years. He held the dog and he wept. For Rivera and the 47 minutes. For his mother and the Thursday phone calls. For Farid and the promise on a desk in Washington. For Thomas and Sarah and a letter written to a dead woman. And for himself. For the bullet on the windowsill and the empty apartment and the 3 weeks when he had stopped caring whether he survived the next sunrise. Ranger's tail began to wag once, twice. Then steadily a metronome of warmth and patience, and the particular genius of dogs, which is that they do not require you to explain your grief. They only require you to be present. And Marcus was present. For the first time in years, fully and completely and terrifyingly present. 6 months later, Marcus Hale lived in a small house on the outskirts of Roanoke, Virginia. Not the apartment in Virginia Beach. He had surrendered the lease. The bullet on the windowsill had been thrown into the James River during a walk with Jake on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. No ceremony, no speech. He had simply opened his hand over the water and let the small brass cylinder fall. It made a sound no louder than a raindrop. And then it was gone. He was seeing a therapist at the VA Medical Center in Salem, Virginia, twice a week. Not because someone told him to, because he wanted to. That was the difference. The difference between going through motions and choosing motion. He still had nightmares. He still scanned rooms when he entered them. He still counted exits. He still flinched at sounds that carried the frequencies of combat. But now, when he woke at 3 in the morning, with Rivera's face fading from behind his eyelids, and the sound of helicopter rotors pounding in his ears, he reached down from the edge of the bed and felt warm fur beneath his fingers. Ranger slept on the floor beside him every night, and every night the dog's presence performed a simple, profound act of translation. It translated the darkness from something threatening into something shared. You are not alone. I am here. Go back to sleep. Thomas Avery sold the cabin. He bought a small house in Asheville, 3 blocks from the cemetery where Sarah rested. He began volunteering with the Forest Service, teaching survival skills to new rangers, passing along 28 years of mountain knowledge to a generation that would carry it forward. He and Marcus spoke on the phone every Thursday evening. A tradition neither had formally established, but both honored with the reliability of a standing order. The conversations were rarely long, 10 minutes, sometimes 15. They talked about weather and football and the particular satisfaction of watching a dog discover a new smell on a familiar trail. They did not talk about the cabin. They did not need to. The cabin existed between them the way a shared language exists, not as something spoken, but as something understood. 6 months after the cabin, Marcus received an email. It arrived through a chain of 3 intermediary addresses routed through servers in countries he could not identify, stripped of metadata, carrying no subject line and no text. Only an attachment, a photograph. A man in civilian clothes standing in front of a modest house on a street that could have been in Islamabad or Istanbul or any of a dozen cities where people go when they need to be somewhere other than where they were. The man was thinner than Marcus remembered. Older. His beard was longer. But the eyes were the same. The careful, intelligent, quietly courageous eyes of a man who had once dug through rubble with his bare hands to save a stranger's life. Farid was alive. Marcus stared at the photograph for 20 minutes. He sat on his couch in Roanoke with Ranger at his feet and looked at the face of the man he had promised not to leave behind and had left behind anyway. And he felt something that was not quite relief and not quite absolution, but existed in the territory between the two. A breath held for 5 years, finally released. Not because the outcome was perfect. Farid was alive, but he was not home. He was not safe. He was somewhere in the world, displaced and uncertain, carrying his own collection of promises broken and distances traveled. But he was alive. Through whatever route, whatever danger, whatever combination of luck and courage and stubbornness, Farid Ahmadi had survived. Marcus forwarded the photograph to Jake with 2 words. He made it. Jake replied with 1 word. Good. And that was enough. On a warm morning in late spring, Marcus Hale walked a trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Not the unmarked backcountry paths he had sought 6 months earlier. This was a main trail, well-maintained, clearly blazed, populated by other hikers and families and couples, walking hand in hand and children running ahead with the invincible energy of youth. Sunlight came through the new green canopy in columns and shafts that turned the forest floor into a mosaic of light and shadow. Birds sang. The air smelled of warming earth and rhododendron blossoms, and the particular sweetness of a mountain forest waking up after winter. Ranger walked beside him. The dog moved with an easy, confident gait, 3 legs striking the ground in perfect rhythm, while the fourth, the one that carried the memory of a frozen forest and a desperate journey, and a love so fierce it broke bones rather than be broken, touched down a fraction of a second late on each stride. A limp so subtle that most people would not notice it. But Marcus noticed. He noticed every time, and every time it reminded him of what that limp represented. Not injury, not weakness, the physical evidence of a choice. The choice to act when acting was impossible. The choice to move when the body said stop. The choice to cross a frozen forest on a broken leg because somewhere behind you, someone needed you. And being needed was reason enough to keep going when every other reason had been exhausted. Marcus stopped at an overlook. The Blue Ridge stretched before him in every direction. Ridge after ridge of green mountains rolling toward the horizon like waves frozen in the act of crashing. The same mountains he had come to 6 months ago to disappear. The same mountains that had given him instead of the ending. He sought a beginning he never expected. Ranger sat beside him, its nose working the mountain air. Its tail swept the ground in a slow, contented arc. It was not looking at the view. It was looking at Marcus, checking, confirming, making sure its person was still there. Marcus Hale went into the forest to disappear, but a dog with a broken leg refused to let him. It did not save him with love, not the way stories usually tell it. It saved him by giving him something to do, someone to carry, a direction to walk when every direction felt the same. It saved him by being broken in a way that demanded action, and in demanding action, it reminded a man who had forgotten the purpose of his own hands. That hands are not made for holding bullets. They are made for holding on. And sometimes that is all any of us need. Not someone to tell us that life is worth living, but someone who needs us to prove it. Marcus looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked up at him, tail wagging. They kept walking, together, into the green, warming, imperfect, beautiful world that was waiting for both of them on the other side of the mountain they had already crossed. If you are watching this and you are a veteran, or you love a veteran, or you have ever stood at an edge and wondered whether it was worth stepping back, I want you to hear this. You are not alone. You are not broken beyond repair, and you do not have to carry the weight by yourself. Call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Talk to someone. Reach out. Because somewhere out there, there is a ranger looking for you. And all you have to do is let yourself be found. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or someone you love, or someone you lost, or someone you are still fighting to save, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us what kept you going when you wanted to stop. Your story might be the one that pulls someone else back from the edge. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being here.